Next, we're moving on to Chapter 3, Urban Reformers. Now, Ida Tarbell and Upton Sinclair were not the only early reformers during the Progressive era. There were two other famous urban reformers, Jane Addams and Jacob Riis. Jane Addams was born to a life of comfort. Her father thought women should be educated. But when her mother died when she was a young girl, her father remarried and had more children. Jane did not get along with her new stepmother, and her new stepmother did not want her to get an education. Eventually, her father passed on, and she became a very wealthy young woman. She was able to travel through Europe, and it was her experiences in Europe that opened her eyes to the misery of others. While she was in Europe, what Addams witnessed haunted her for the rest of her life. She saw poor, hungry children who were fighting over rotten vegetables. She saw women being burned carrying burning hot beer on their backs. She wanted to make a difference, but people didn't listen to her. On another trip to Europe, she went to a settlement where young men just out of college were living together and volunteering their time to help others. She interviewed many people at the settlement, and she knew that she had an idea of what she could do in Chicago. When Jane went back to Chicago, she started her settlement and called it Hull House. She convinced several wealthy people to provide money and spent thousands of dollars of her own money to renovate the property. At first, people didn't understand her idea, but they quickly came calling: washerwomen, peddlers, factory workers, and children. Hull House had bathtubs where they taught nutrition, they had a daycare center, and children would be looked after. Soon, Addams' ideas for a settlement house spread throughout the country. The new settlement houses had things like gymnasiums and language classes for immigrants. Jane Addams also fought for women's right to vote. She became friends with Theodore Roosevelt, who visited Hull House several times. She was also active in the formation of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Jane Addams eventually received the Nobel Peace Prize for her life's work. Where Jane Addams was the great champion of poor people in Chicago, Jacob Riis became the great champion of the poor people of New York City. He was a Danish carpenter. He arrived in the US during a depression and was unable to find a job. He ate handouts from a fancy restaurant until he could get money. On one of his worst nights, he spent in a police station where homeless men were allowed to sleep. His most prized possession, a necklace, was stolen. His beloved dog Bob was killed. He decided after this experience that he would do all he could to end the abuse of the poor. Riis wanted to tell others about the suffering of the poor immigrants. A quote from Riis says, "It seemed to me that a reporter's was the highest and noblest of all callings. No one could sift right from wrong as he and punish the wrong." At first, no one would give him a job as a reporter, so he would roam the streets of New York to uncover the city's dirty secrets. He used basic detective skills to follow story leads. One time, he was able to prove that infected water was traveling through the New York water supply. Later in his life, Riis was able to get a job as a reporter in the same part of New York where he had been homeless. He wrote about life in the tenements. At first, not many people read his writings, but Riis discovered a new tool that would help him get his point across. By using a flash bulb to take pictures in the dark, he could add human elements to his stories. This is one of the photos that he took in 1890. Now, Riis's muckraking covered many topics. He wrote about children who did not go to school. He wrote about children who spent their days cooped up in dark, windowless rooms. He wrote about the use of underage children as workers in factories. His work changed things in New York City. He succeeded in having several blocks of tenements purchased and torn down by the city to be turned into a grass-filled park where children could play. Theodore Roosevelt described him as the most useful citizen in America.